The wind howled through the trees as the dark clouds gathered over the mountain. Widow's Peak was shrouded in an eerie fog, with the only light coming from the flickering glow of a lone lantern inside the cabin perched on the edge of the cliff. Long ago, this mountain had been the home of Eleanor, a widow whose life had been consumed by grief after the mysterious disappearance of her husband Thomas. It was said that Thomas had gone on a dangerous climb, one that took him to the very edge of Widow's Peak, where treacherous winds and icy conditions made it impossible for even the most seasoned climbers to survive. But despite the dangers, Eleanor clung to the hope that her husband would return. Day after day, she stood at the window, gazing out at the mountain, waiting for him to come back. Years passed, and the villagers whispered that Eleanor had lost her mind. Her sorrow had turned into something darker, something that could not be explained. The once peaceful cabin at Widow's Peak had become a place of rumors and terror. People spoke of strange noises coming from the cabin at night, the sound of a woman's voice crying out in the wind, pleading for her lost husband. Some claimed to have seen her, a pale figure in white, wandering the mountain, her face twisted in anguish. One cold winter night, a group of travelers seeking shelter from the storm found themselves at the foot of Widow's Peak. They had heard the stories of the haunted cabin, but had dismissed them as nothing more than superstition. Desperate for warmth, they made their way up the winding path, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. As they reached the cabin, they could hear the faint sound of crying echoing in the cold night air. It was as if the very mountain itself was weeping. The travelers knocked on the door, and to their surprise, it creaked open by itself. Inside, the flickering lantern cast strange shadows on the walls, and a heavy silence filled the room. The travelers hesitated but stepped inside, one by one. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the temperature had dropped significantly. They couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As the door slammed shut behind them, they realized they were not alone. Suddenly, a low, mournful wail filled the cabin. The travelers turned toward the sound, only to see a woman standing in the doorway. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her white dress billowed in the wind that seemed to come from nowhere. It was Eleanor, or rather something that resembled her. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I waited for him to return, but now I must wait for all of you." The travelers backed away, their hearts racing in terror. The door was locked, and the windows were sealed shut. There was no escape. As Eleanor's spirit advanced, the walls seemed to close in around them. The cabin, once a home to love and warmth, had become a prison of despair, where those who entered would never leave. One by one, the travelers were drawn into the spirit's grip. Their screams echoed through the cabin, but there was no one to hear them. The mountains swallowed their cries, just as it had done with Thomas so many years ago. The widow's vengeance had been unleashed. The last traveler, trembling and weak, could barely stand as Eleanor's ghost hovered before him. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, and for a moment he saw the reflection of his own fear in them. She whispered, "Your souls are now mine." With that, the wind howled louder, and the cabin seemed to shake with the force of her anger. The traveler collapsed to the floor, and just like the others before him, he vanished into the mountain, his body consumed by the widow's eternal sorrow. The crying widow's vengeance would never cease. The cabin at Widow's Peak would forever be a place where the lost souls of those who dared enter would be trapped, never to escape the grief and fury of Eleanor's restless spirit.